In the high mountains where the wind never stopped howling and the trees clung to the rocks like they were afraid to fall, there was a village no one remembered. It wasn't on most maps. If you asked someone in the capital about it, they'd squint and say, "Corva? Is that even real?" But it was real, very real to the people who lived there. And right now it was dying. For months the roads in and out had been blocked. Not by snow or landslides, but by soldiers. Men with rifles and hard eyes stood at every pass, turning back anyone who tried to leave or bring anything in. At first people thought it would only last a few days. Maybe a week. Governments changed, armies moved, promises were made. But this time no one came back. No trucks with flour or medicine. No radio messages that weren't just static. Just silence. The village had always been poor, but it had been enough. They grew potatoes in rocky soil, kept goats that gave thin milk, and collected rainwater in old barrels. They knew how to stretch a meal, how to mend a coat until it was more patch than fabric. But now enough was gone. The last sack of grain ran out weeks ago. The goats had been eaten one by one, starting with the oldest, then the sick ones, then the young. Now there were none left. The children's bellies swelled not from food, but from hunger. Every morning the same routine began. People rose before dawn, not because they had work, but because lying in the dark made the ache worse. They'd check on the sick, those with fevers, coughs that wouldn't quit, wounds that festered because there was no soap, no clean cloth, no antibiotics. One woman boiled the same handful of herbs over and over, hoping the water might still hold some healing. It didn't, but she kept doing it anyway. Hope wasn't something you could throw away even when it stopped working. The well in the center of the village still had water, but it tasted bitter now. Something upstream had poisoned it, maybe chemicals from a bombed factory, maybe waste from a camp no one talked about. 2 children got sick after drinking it. One recovered. The other didn't. They buried him under a flat stone near the old chapel, the one with the roof half caved in. No one had the strength to dig deep. They tried to send messages. A young man with a broken radio climbed the highest ridge and held the antenna toward the sky for hours, whispering into the mic. "This is Corva. We need help. Please." But the only answer was wind. Another time they tied notes to the legs of the few birds that still came, pigeons mostly, and let them fly. They never knew if the birds made it or if anyone who found the notes even cared. Days blurred together. Hunger made time slow and heavy. People stopped talking much. Words took energy. Instead, they sat in doorways, wrapped in thin blankets, watching the sky for planes that never came. Sometimes they'd hear distant explosions, booms that rolled through the valley like thunder. But no one flinched anymore. Fear had worn itself out. What was left was just waiting. An old woman, the one everyone went to for advice before the world closed in, now spent her days braiding strips of cloth. She said it kept her hands busy, but really it was because she couldn't bear to watch the children grow weaker. Her own grandson hadn't smiled in weeks. He just stared at the wall, eyes too big for his face. She'd hum old songs while she braided, soft and low like a secret. One afternoon, a group gathered near the dry riverbed. Not for a meeting, no one had the breath for speeches, but just to be near each other. A man held up a rusted can. "Found this in the shed," he said. "Still has a little oil in it." It wasn't food, but oil could keep a lamp burning. Light meant something. It meant you weren't alone in the dark. They passed it around like it was gold. At night, the cold bit deep. Families huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat like it was currency. Someone would tell a story about a harvest festival years ago, about a wedding where they danced until sunrise. The stories weren't true anymore, but they felt real while they were being told. For a few minutes, the hunger didn't matter. The silence didn't win, they didn't cry much. Tears took water the body couldn't spare. But sometimes, in the quietest part of the night, you'd hear a soft sound, a breath catching, a muffled sob pressed into a pillow. And no one would say anything. They'd just move a little closer, a hand on a shoulder, a nod in the dark. That was how they said, "I'm still here. You're not alone." They had tried everything. They'd rationed until there was nothing left to ration. They'd prayed in every language they knew. They'd sent their strongest to scout the passes, only to have them turn back, bleeding from shrapnel or too weak to go on. Now all they could do was wait. Not for rescue. That felt like a dream from another life, but for whatever came next. Maybe peace. Maybe death. Maybe just another day of holding on. And still they held on, because giving up would mean the village truly disappeared. As long as one person breathed, Corva existed. As long as one child whispered a question, there was still a future, however thin. So they woke up. They shared the last spoonful of porridge. They checked the sick. They watched the sky. They waited. Not with hope, not anymore, but with stubbornness. The kind that doesn't need a reason. The kind that says, I am here and I will not vanish quietly. Outside the valley, the world moved on. Markets opened. Songs played on radios. People argued about things that felt huge but wouldn't matter in a year. But in Corva, time had narrowed to a single point. Survive today. Tomorrow could take care of itself. And so, in the wind and the cold and the silence, they endured. Not as heroes, not as symbols. Just as people, ordinary, tired, scared, but still standing. Still breathing. Still waiting, because sometimes that's all you can do, and sometimes it's enough. Outside the valley, the world kept turning. News channels flashed images of crowded cities, celebrity weddings, sports victories, bright, loud, fast-moving things that filled screens and then vanished. Once, for just a few seconds, a reporter mentioned a remote region facing humanitarian concerns. But the words were vague, buried between weather updates and stock market numbers. No one paused. No one asked, where is that? Who lives there? The story didn't have a face, so it didn't stick. In offices with polished desks and coffee machines that steamed milk, people in suits looked at maps and spreadsheets. Too risky, one said, tapping a red zone with a pen. The roads are mined, the factions won't guarantee safe passage. Another nodded. We've got bigger crises. Refugee camps with 50,000 people, not a few hundred in some mountain hole. They weren't cruel. They were practical. And in their world, practical meant choosing where to send help based on numbers, access, and headlines. Corva had none of those aid groups tried. Really, they did. One small organization sent a drone to scout the area. It flew over the valley, capturing shaky footage of smokeless chimneys and empty fields. But before they could plant a drop, their local contact was arrested. Another group gathered supplies, bags of rice, water purifiers, antibiotics, but their convoy was turned back at the first checkpoint. The soldiers didn't shout. They just stood there, rifles slung over their shoulders, shaking their heads. No one goes in. No one comes out. The aid workers left, hearts heavy, knowing they'd failed people they'd never met. Back in Corva, no one knew any of this. They didn't know about the drone, the turned-away trucks, the meetings where their lives were weighed against logistics. All they knew was that the sky stayed empty. No planes, no helicopters, no distant hum of engines that might mean help. Just silence. Inside the village, time stretched thin. People moved slower now, not just from hunger, but from the weight of being forgotten. A young teacher, once full of energy, always scribbling lessons in the margins of old notebooks, now sat by the window each evening, writing in a small journal. Not for anyone else, just to prove something still happened. Day 63, she wrote. Old man Yusuf shared his last piece of bread with the twins. He says he's too old to need much, but I saw him chewing grass later. She didn't write with anger, just facts, because if no one else would remember, she would. Children stopped playing. There was no energy for games, no sticks to pretend were swords, no laughter to echo off the hills. They sat quietly, watching adults with eyes that understood too much. One little girl carried a smooth stone in her pocket everywhere she went. She called it her egg, said it would hatch into a bird that would fly them all away. No one corrected her. Let her dream. Dreams cost nothing. At night, the cold deepened. Blankets were patched so many times they were more thread than wool. Families slept 3 or 4 to a bed, not for comfort, but survival. Body heat was precious. Sometimes someone would wake up shivering and realize the person beside them wasn't breathing. They'd close the eyes gently, whisper a few words, and wait for daylight to dig another shallow grave. Still, small acts of care continued. A woman boiled the same tea leaves 5 times, then gave the weak brew to a sick neighbor. A boy gave his portion of watery soup to his younger sister, saying he wasn't hungry, even though his ribs showed through his shirt. These weren't grand gestures. They were quiet rebellions against despair. One morning, a rumor spread. A radio signal had been heard. Faint but clear, someone claimed it said help was coming next week. Hope flickered, just for a moment. People stood a little straighter. They washed their faces with precious drops of water. But days passed. No trucks. No voices on the ridge. The signal was never heard again. Maybe it was real. Maybe it was static shaped by wishful thinking. Either way, the letdown was heavier than the hunger. They began to wonder if they'd been erased. Not killed, just removed from the world's memory. Like a photo tossed in a drawer and forgotten. What if, when this was over, no one would even know they'd been here? That thought hurt more than empty stomachs. In the capital, a journalist filed a story about the conflict. It was well written, full of quotes from generals and politicians. But Corva wasn't mentioned, not once. The journalist hadn't been allowed near the region, so he wrote what he could, and what he could write didn't include them. Meanwhile, in homes thousands of miles away, people scrolled through phones, liked posts about global crises, donated $5 to a big charity, and went back to their lives. They meant well. But their concern was like rain on a roof, brief, distant, never touching the ground where it was needed. Back in the valley, a man stood on the edge of the field where his family had grown barley for generations. Now it was just cracked earth and weeds. He picked up a handful of dirt and let it slip through his fingers. "We're still here," he whispered, not sure if he was talking to the land, to God, or to himself. The teacher kept writing. Day 78. Little Sammy asked if stars are holes in the sky where light leaks through. I told him yes. Maybe it's true. Maybe somewhere light is getting in. They stopped expecting rescue. Instead, they focused on the next hour. Boil water. Check on the sick. Share a memory. Keep breathing. It wasn't hope, not the bright, bold kind. It was something quieter. A refusal to let the silence win. And so, while the world moved on, unaware or unable to act, the people of the valley did the only thing left to them. They bore witness to their own existence. They lived even when living felt impossible. They remembered each other even when the world forgot, because being seen matters, being remembered matters, and if no one else would do it, they would do it for themselves. In the end, that was all they had. And somehow, it was still something. It started with a sound no one in the village had heard in months, the low growl of an engine. At first, they thought it was a trick of the wind, or maybe a memory playing tricks on tired minds. But then it came again, deeper, closer. People stepped out of doorways, squinting toward the ridge where the old goat trail twisted down from the North Pass. No one had used that path in weeks. It was watched, dangerous. But there, dust rising against the gray sky, was a vehicle, battered, mud-caked, its paint long gone, but moving. Hearts pounded. Some ducked back inside, fearing soldiers. Others stood frozen, too weak to run, too numb to hope. But the vehicle didn't stop at the edge. It kept coming, bouncing over rocks, tires slipping in the loose gravel, until it rolled to a halt in the center of the empty square. The door creaked open. Out stepped a man in a worn jacket, boots cracked from miles of walking. He wasn't in uniform. No insignia, no flag. Just a backpack slung over one shoulder and a look in his eyes that said he'd seen hard things before, and hadn't flinched. Behind him came others. A woman with short hair and a medical bag, another with tools strapped to his belt, a younger one scanning the hills with quiet alertness. No one spoke. The villagers just stared, too stunned to move. Who were these people? Why were they here? And how had they gotten through? The first man raised his hands, palms out. "We're not soldiers," he said, voice rough but calm. "We're with a group that helps where help's needed. We heard about this place." Heard? How? No one had gotten a message out. But before anyone could ask, the woman with the medical bag was already moving toward the nearest house where a child had been coughing for days. She didn't wait for permission. She just went in like she belonged there. That's when the villagers realized these weren't officials. They weren't here because of orders or politics. They were here because they chose to be. Over the next few hours, the strangers worked like they'd been sent by the earth itself. The man with tools found the broken hand pump by the well, and with parts from his pack got it working again. Clean water, cold and clear, gushing into a bucket for the first time in weeks. The young one rigged a solar panel to a dead radio, and suddenly faint voices crackled through the static. Not promises, just weather reports, but it was proof the world was still out there. The medical woman moved from house to house, checking pulses, cleaning wounds with antiseptic she carried in small bottles, giving pills that looked like miracles. She didn't speak much, but her hands were gentle. When a mother handed her a feverish baby, she didn't hesitate. just cradled the child like it was her own and got to work. One old man leaning on a stick watched them with narrowed eyes. "You came through the Eastern Pass?" he asked the first man. "Yeah," the man said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Took 3 days on foot after the truck got stuck. Lost 2 tires to shrapnel, but we made it." The old man nodded slowly. That pass was known for ambushes, landmines, sudden rockfalls. To walk it willingly, it didn't make sense, unless you didn't care about danger, or you were used to it. Later, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, the villagers gathered what little they had, a bowl of thin broth, a handful of dried berries, and offered it to the newcomers. The strangers refused at first. "You need it more," the woman said. But the villagers insisted. "You walked into hell for us," someone said. "At least let us feed you." So they ate together, sitting on stones and broken crates, sharing silence and small words. One of the villagers finally asked, "Why did you come?" No one else did. The man with the backpack looked at the faces around him. Hollow cheeks, tired eyes, but still watching, still present. "Because someone had to," he said simply. "And because we've been in places like this before." He didn't say more, but the others understood. These people carried themselves like survivors. Not heroes, just people who'd seen the worst and hadn't turned away. They moved with a kind of calm that only comes from knowing you can't fix everything, but you can still do something. That night, they set up tents near the chapel. Not inside the houses. They didn't want to take space or warmth. They built a small fire, not for cooking, but for light. And for the first time in months, the village didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like it was breathing again. A child crept close to the fire, eyes wide. The young one with the solar panel smiled and handed her a small flashlight. "For when it's dark," he said. She clutched it like treasure. Word spread fast. Help had come. Not armies. Not promises. Just hands, tools, medicine, and the stubborn belief that no one should be left to die alone. By morning, the strangers were already working again. One cleared rubble from the path to the spring. Another taught a group how to purify water using cloth and charcoal. The medical woman showed a teenager how to wrap a wound so it wouldn't get worse. They didn't talk down. They didn't act like saviors. They just showed up and stayed, and the villagers slowly began to move again too. Not just to survive, but to help. A woman brought clean rags for bandages. A boy led the tool man to a hidden stash of nails and wire. Someone started sweeping the square as if preparing for life to return. No one said it out loud, but a shift had happened. The waiting was over. Not because the siege had ended, but because they weren't alone in it anymore. And as the strangers worked, one old woman whispered to her neighbor, "They must be from Earth, the death world. Only those who've walked through fire could walk into ours without fear." The neighbor didn't answer, but she watched the man with the backpack lift a heavy stone off the path, his arms trembling but steady, and she knew what the old woman meant. These weren't gods. They were humans. Just humans who refused to look away, and in that moment, that was enough. Work began in earnest the next morning, not with fanfare but with shovels, buckets, and tired hands that refused to quit. The strangers didn't wait for permission or perfect plans. They saw what was needed and started doing it. One dug a new latrine away from the water source. Another strung a tarp between 2 trees to make a shaded clinic. The woman with the medical bag sorted her supplies on a wooden crate, labeling bottles with charcoal when the ink ran out. The villagers watched at first, unsure if this was real or just another cruel dream. But when clean water flowed from the repaired well and a child's fever finally broke after days of shaking, doubt gave way to quiet trust. People started helping, not because they were told to, but because they saw others trying, and it reminded them they still had something to give. A teenager who hadn't spoken in weeks began carrying buckets of water back and forth, his thin arms straining but steady. An older man who'd spent days staring at the wall showed the newcomers where the best clay could be found for sealing cracks in the roof. Even the little girl with the egg stone followed the medical woman around, handing her clean cloths without being asked. She didn't say much, but her eyes were bright again. But the valley wasn't safe just because help had arrived. Danger hadn't gone away. It had noticed them. On the 3rd night, the sky lit up with distant flashes. Not lightning, artillery. The booms rolled in slow and heavy, shaking dust from the rafters. Everyone froze. The strangers didn't panic. They'd heard that sound before. One of them quickly gathered the children and led them to the cellar beneath the chapel, the safest spot they'd found. Another checked the perimeter, not with a weapon but with quiet alertness, listening for movement. Then, just before dawn, it happened. A mortar round landed on the eastern edge of the village, close enough to rattle windows, far enough not to kill. But it was a message. "We see you." The next day, the strangers didn't leave. If anything, they worked harder. "They're testing us," the man with the backpack said quietly, "seeing if we'll run." He looked at the villagers. "We won't." But the cost came soon after. While setting up a new water filter near the dry creek bed, two of the group were caught in a sudden burst of gunfire from the ridge. It wasn't aimed at them directly, more like warning shots meant to scare. But one of the younger ones took shrapnel in the leg. He went down fast, biting his lip to keep from crying out. The medical woman was there in seconds, pressing a bandage, her voice calm even as her hands moved fast. "You're okay. You're okay," she kept saying, though his face was pale with pain. They carried him back to the makeshift clinic. No one spoke much. But that night, as the wounded one drifted in and out of sleep, the villagers took turns sitting outside his tent. Not to guard, but to be near. To show they saw his sacrifice. Then, 2 nights later, the real blow came. A shell hit the storage shed where they kept extra food and medicine. The explosion wasn't huge, but it was enough. Flames licked the dry wood and smoke poured into the cold air. People ran, not away but toward it, grabbing buckets, beating at the fire with coats and blankets. The strangers were in the thick of it, pulling crates from the heat, coughing, sweating despite the chill. In the chaos, one of them, a quiet man who'd spent his days fixing stoves and teaching kids how to boil water safely, pushed 2 children out of the way, just as part of the roof collapsed. He didn't make it out. They found him under the beam, still curled around the space where the children had been. No one cried out. Not then. Grief in a place like this was too heavy for noise. They carried him out slowly, wrapped in a clean sheet someone had saved for special occasions. The villagers gathered without being called. They dug a grave next to the others, not deep but careful. Every handful of dirt was placed with respect. Afterward, the medical woman sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly. One of the village women sat beside her, not speaking, just placing a cup of weak tea in her hands. They stayed like that for a long time. The next morning, the man with the backpack stood before the group, both strangers and villagers. His voice was low but clear. He knew the risks, he said. We all do. But he stayed because he believed these lives mattered. And they do. So we keep going. Not for him, for you. And they did. Work resumed before noon. The water filter was rebuilt. A new storage area was dug into the hillside, covered with branches for camouflage. The wounded one, leg bandaged and propped up, started teaching older kids how to clean wounds with boiled cloth. "If I can't run," he said with a weak smile, "I can at least make sure you know what to do when I'm gone." The villagers changed too. They weren't just waiting to be saved anymore. They were part of the saving. A woman who'd lost her husband early in the siege now organized food portions with military precision. A boy who used to hide during explosions now helped scout the ridges, reporting back with hand signals. They weren't soldiers, but they were no longer helpless. One evening, as the sun painted the peaks gold, the man with the backpack sat with the old woman who'd first called them Deathworlders. She handed him a small pouch of dried herbs. "For your tea," she said. "It helps with sleep," he thanked her. Then, after a pause, he said, "Earth isn't a death world. It's just hard sometimes, but people keep showing up for each other. That's the strange thing," she nodded. "Maybe that's what makes it worth living on." Days passed. The shelling didn't stop, but it became background noise, something to work around, not something that stopped life. Meals were shared. Stories were told. A child laughed for the first time in months when the young volunteer made a toy from scrap wire. It wasn't much, but it was life, and in that valley, life, fragile, stubborn, precious, was returning. Not because the war was over, but because people chose every day to care more than fear. The change didn't come with a bang or a grand announcement. It came quietly, like the first green shoot pushing through cracked earth after a long winter. One morning, the distant gunfire stopped. Not for a few hours, this time it stayed quiet. Scouts sent to the ridges came back with news. The checkpoints were empty. The soldiers were gone. No one knew why, maybe orders from higher up, maybe they'd moved to another front. But the road out was open. At first, no one dared believe it. They'd been tricked by silence before. But then, 2 days later, a battered truck appeared on the horizon. Not the stranger's vehicle, but a white one with a red cross painted on the side. Aid workers. Real ones this time, with official papers and satellite phones and crates of supplies stacked high. They rolled into the village with wide eyes, stunned by what they found. Not a ghost town, but people, alive, organized, tending small gardens, boiling water in clean pots, children sitting in a circle learning to read from a tattered book. How, one of them asked, looking at the repaired well, the patched roofs, the clinic under the tarp. The villagers just pointed to the small group of tired-looking travelers packing up their gear near the chapel. The official aid team wanted to take over immediately, set up tents, run tests, file reports. But the villagers asked for one thing first: let the others stay a little longer, just until they were sure this wasn't another false dawn. So the strangers stayed, not as rescuers now, but as friends. They helped unload the new supplies, showed the aid workers where the cleanest water sources were, introduced them to the families who needed care most. There was no jealousy, no competition, just quiet cooperation. Everyone knew the real work had already been done in the darkest days when no one was watching. As the days passed, life began to shift again. Radios crackled with real news. A doctor arrived and confirmed what the medical woman had suspected. The fever that had taken so many was typhoid, treatable now with the right antibiotics. Food parcels brought rice, beans, even powdered milk for the children. For the first time in months, bellies were full. Not stuffed, just full enough to dream again. But with safety came a new kind of pain, the weight of what had been lost. Now that they weren't fighting to survive each hour, the grief had room to breathe. People visited the graves more often. They spoke the names of those who didn't make it. A mother placed a small carved bird, a gift from the young volunteer, on her son's stone. No tears, just a hand resting on cold rock, a whisper of love that wouldn't fade. The strangers knew their time was ending. They'd stayed longer than planned, but other places needed them. Other valleys, other silences waiting to be broken. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the mountains in soft orange, the villagers gathered not in fear but in thanks. No speeches. No grand gestures, just presence. An old woman stepped forward and handed the man with the backpack a scarf woven from goat hair and dyed with wild berries. "You said you came because someone had to," she said. "But we needed more than someone. We needed people who saw us. Not just our hunger, our hearts." He took it, his throat tight. He didn't say much, just nodded and tucked it into his coat like something sacred. The next morning, their vehicle was ready. Not as battered as when they arrived. Some parts had been patched with village scrap metal, the windshield cleaned with vinegar and cloth, but still rough, still ready for the next hard road. The villagers came out to say goodbye, not with tears, but with steady eyes and small gifts: a pouch of dried fruit, a carved spoon, a child's drawing tucked into a pocket. One of the teenagers who'd carried water every day walked with them to the edge of the village. "Will you come back?" he asked. The medical woman smiled gently. "Not here, but somewhere else. Someone will need what you've learned. Pass it on." He nodded. He understood. As the engine rumbled to life, the little girl with the stone egg ran forward and pressed it into the young volunteer's hand. "It hatched," she whispered. "The bird flew away, but it left this for you." He opened his palm. Inside was a smooth white stone, just like hers, but smaller. He slipped it into his pocket without a word. The vehicle turned onto the mountain path, dust rising behind it. The villagers stood and watched until it disappeared over the ridge. Then slowly they turned back, not to waiting, but to living. In the weeks that followed, the village didn't just recover. It rebuilt. They dug deeper wells. They stored food for winter. They taught each other how to treat wounds, purify water, spot signs of illness. The journal that had recorded days of despair now held plans for a new school, for a seed bank, for a radio that could reach the outside world and say, "We are here." And the story of the strangers spread, not as legend, but as truth. In nearby villages, when people felt forgotten, they'd say, "Remember Corva. Help comes when you least expect it, but only if you keep the light on." Meanwhile, far away on another broken road in another forgotten place, a different battered vehicle rolled to a stop. The same man with the scarf now tied around his neck stepped out, looked at the hollow-eyed faces watching from doorways, and said the words he'd said before. "We're not soldiers. We're here to help. Because on Earth, the so-called death world, people don't wait for heroes. They become them, not with capes or speeches, but with bandages, clean water, and the simple act of showing up when no one else will. And in the end, that's what saves us. Not miracles, not armies, just ordinary people refusing to let each other disappear." Back in the valley, the wind still howled. The mountains still stood tall and cold, but now smoke rose from chimneys. Children's voices carried on the air. And in the center of the village, the well flowed clear and strong, a quiet promise that life once nearly lost would not be forgotten again.